Greetings! Today I'm going to show you my method for using Logic Pro X to create big stacks of rich, beautiful vocal harmony parts a la the Beach Boys. I use it to make things like this. Okay, so that's an 8-bar vocal interlude from a song that I'm working on called Anchor. To give you an idea of how I'm using it in the tune, I'll play through that one more time in the context of the larger mix, and then we'll get started on the process for how I made it. Okay, so there it is in the mix of the song. It took me about, I'd say 2 hours to create that vocal interlude and drop it into the big picture of the song. Let's get started on my process for how I did it. All right, so step one is to arrange the part that you're going to be singing, or the parts that you're going to be singing in MIDI. Mine looks like this, and I'll just play through it really quickly. And basically I do that by first creating an instrument track, and then I load in an instrument, preferably a vocal sample library if you have one. We're going to use East West Instruments Hollywood Backup Singers. So once you've created your instrument track, you've loaded in your vocal sample library, then you're just going to arrange your vocal part. Now, I'm in no way an experienced vocal arranger. Honestly, I couldn't tell you where tenor parts end and where alto parts begin. I've never been in a choir. In this case, my vocal parts are just outlining the chords of the song with some passing tones and some movement, which might be why I need to do this step to outline what it is I'm going to sing. So I'll just key in the chords of the song and then start monkeying with the arrangement and seeing if I like all of the inversions and seeing if there's melodies within the melodies. And also, and here's actually my finished version of what I call my MIDI vocal guide. And it also allows me to listen to the highest notes and the lowest notes and make sure they're both within my vocal range. In this case, the highest notes will have to be falsetto for me, and the lowest notes are within my range. So I'm good to go. And so that's step one, arrange the parts in MIDI. Okay, so we're ready for step two. Step two is going to be to take our MIDI arrangement and to separate it into individual parts. In this case, I've done mine as a 3-part harmony. So what I like to do is I like to take this instrument track and copy it 3 times. Now let's call it low, middle, and high. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this region and I'm going to key Option. I'm just going to drag it to each one. So I'm copying this region onto each track. And then what I'm going to do is go through to each one, starting with the low, or starting wherever you want to start. But for each track, I want to erase all the triggers except for that part. So on the low, I'm erasing the high and middle voices. And I'm going to do this eventually for the middle and the high as well. But what that leaves me with is just what I need to sing for the low part, so that when I'm actually recording it and I need to go back and reference these to tell myself what to sing, I don't have to find it in the middle of the full arrangement. I can hear what just the low part is before I sing it. And I'm going to do that for all 3 tracks. And once I've done that, I'm ready for step 3. Okay, so step 3 is to record all the parts in digestible 2-bar sections. So we're going to record all of the vocal parts that we laid out on our MIDI tracks, but we're going to do it 2 bars at a time, section by section, to make it digestible and easy to remember the parts. So start off by creating an audio track. And for me, my microphone that I'm using is attached to input number 3. Now, before I go in the booth and I start singing this, a few notes. We are going to, for this example, I'm going to be singing the last 2 bars of this arrangement. Reason being is it's very important to remember that your sample instrument that you're using to arrange it is only dynamic if you program in the dynamics. But you want your vocal part to be dynamic. In this case, I have a crescendo at the end of this vocal part, so I'm gonna record the last 2 bars to show you how I do it, so that you can hear that crescendo. Now let's set up this track that we created to record optimally. The first thing I want to do is I want to come in here to record, to overlapping audio recordings, and under cycle on, I want to check create take folder. And what that means is this button right here is cycle recording. I want it to be on. And once I'm in cycle recording, I can identify where the loop is going to be by dragging this yellow across the timeline. In this case, I'm going to make the loop the last 2 bars of this arrangement, plus 1 more bar to give myself a little time to breathe. And I'm going to turn the click on so I can start back at the right time. So what I'll be hearing is, for example, if I'm singing the low part, while I'm singing along, is I'll be hearing the MIDI guide like this. And I might turn it down quite a bit so that I can hear my voice louder than I hear the MIDI guide. And I'll hear the click so I know where the beat is. Now, when I record, the way Logic works is since we're on cycle recording and since we have create take folder chosen, and I'll show you what's going to happen as we record, we'll begin singing through this loop, and I'll be singing along with this MIDI, and then it loops back around. Now watch what happens. And you see Logic has saved what I recorded in take folders. So now if I had been singing, there would be 3 take folders of audio. So at the end, when I want to go through and comp, I have all of the different times that I sang this part. So I can sing it as many times as I like to get it right. And the loop is going to start at the same place. And I have a measure to give myself some breath. So now that we're all set up to record, let's go in the booth and let's perform step number 3, which is record in 2-bar sections. Okay, so we've completed step number 3. We've sung all of the parts in digestible 2-bar sections, and we should be left with tracks that have audio tracks that have these audio take folders in them that look like this. I have one for low, one for middle, and one for high. And now we're ready for step number 4, which is to comp these parts, which basically means we're just going to choose the performances that we like best. In this case, of this part, I sang it 7 times. I'm gonna have to decide how many of this voice I want in my arrangement. I'm gonna go with 2. You can use more if you want your arrangement to be bigger, especially if while you're recording you want to experiment with different timbres of your voice and different different locations with respect to the microphone, sometimes you can make these parts even bigger. But for the purpose of this example, we're going to do 2 of each. And the way I like to do that is by just copying the track. So I have another one down here. And then as I choose the part I like, let's say I had decided I like take number 5 or take number 4, I'll then copy this region down here, which is muted. And I'll come back to this main track and I'll continue to listen. And maybe I'll choose part number 6. So now I have 2 versions of this audio. Let's listen to what that sounds like. Now I can go through to my other tracks. Let's say I do the middle voice, and I would do the same thing. I would just copy this track. I would choose one of the middle voices, place it on the other middle voice track, and then come back to the original, choose another one. And now I've got my 2 middle voices. And once I've done that for all of the voices in my arrangement, I'm done with step number 4. Okay, so step 5 is to edit the individual vocal parts that we've comped. So the way I like to do this, presumably at this point, I've saved this session. So I have the raw audio for all these tracks somewhere else, and I've saved this take folder. So since I've done that, I feel good about flattening it. And what I like to do for these is basically just trim them, make sure that I've got all of the transient. I look what's before it. In this case, that's my breath that came just before it. So when you flatten these, the way Logic works, the other takes are still contained in this file. So I've still got access to the other takes. I actually wouldn't have to go back to my saved file. I could go replace this particular take with any of these others that are on the timeline. But when you flatten it, it just shows you the take that's current to that part of the timeline. And we're not going to include the breath. You can see the breath behind it. But I want to make sure that all of the transient is included. In this case, sometimes I might go through and remove some of the transients from some of the stacks of the vocal harmonies so that we don't have this buildup of these sibilant things like T's and S's. In this case, this part doesn't have many sibilant consonants. It's just oohs. The only thing you really have is a little bit of breath that that's kind of like an H at the beginning of some of them. So we have to be a little careful not to let that build up too much from an EQ standpoint, but we'll handle that later. In any event, all I really do at the editing stage is trim them down to the part and then put a little fader at the beginning and the end so they don't jump in. And the other thing I might do, especially if these parts were a little bit more complicated, is I might make sure that they're from track to track, that they're rhythmically similar to one another. And I basically just do that visually at this point because you can hear it, but if they look visually pretty close, they probably sound pretty close as well. And with all of these parts, they really don't have to be perfect. And to an extent, you kind of don't want them perfect. If they're too perfect, you lose some of the texture and some of the graininess, and it becomes less interesting and it sounds more sterile. So you don't want to over edit these things, but you do want to take care of any glaring issues. The main thing is to just trim them down and put a little fader on the end of each one, and then you're edited. Then you're done with step 5 and you're ready for step 6. Okay, at this point you should have edited all of the parts that you sang and comped, and you should be ready for step number 6, which is to pitch correct. So let me play you what I have so far. Oh, and I want to make one point before we get into how to pitch correct them, or how I like to pitch correct them. I've added a couple of parts to here that I didn't mention earlier in the process. I felt like the whole part could use a little bit more bottom end, so I added a bass part, which is basically just the high part an octave lower. And I've also added at the very end 2 harmony vocals during the crescendo That crescendo is a really nice sounding G sharp diminished chord, and I thought it was an opportunity for a nice harmonic, interesting sounding harmonic cluster as it crescendos towards the next section of the song. So there's a few parts that we didn't have in our MIDI mock-up of the whole thing, but at this point, this is what we sound like. I have panned a little bit, so typically I do that during mixing, but there's a lot of build up in the middle, and I wanted it to pan a little bit so you could hear it. So here's where we are before any pitch correction or mixing or processing. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that so far. We haven't pitch corrected anything. We haven't processed it, and it already sounds pretty good, pretty spacious to my ears anyway. Let me show you how I like to do the pitch correcting. So in my opinion, Logic Pro X has a wonderful vocal pitch correction tool in the flexible audio portion. So I'm going to use this middle voice right here, which I've opened up down here in the edit window, and I've turned on the flexible audio. It's this blue icon here. So if it's off, it's going to look like this. And then you've got your region loaded into the edit window down here. You click flexible audio, and then you tell it flex pitch. And at that point, it's going to assign these little pitch bars to each of the little waveform blobs. And as you can see the keyboard over here on the right. Each of these blobs is sitting, that keyboard is shadowed here across the timeline. And you can actually see physically see the sung note sitting on its closest note on the piano keyboard. And if you roll it over this dot right here, it'll show you in terms of the fine pitch how many cents above or below you are from the note. So in this case, I'm 36 cents flat of the note. I'll solo this track so you can hear what it sounds like. So my pitch was okay for some of these, but for these higher notes, I was actually quite flat. There's many things that I can do with Logic's flexible audio, which is almost, I could make that a separate tutorial. The one thing I would caution you is I like to keep things sounding natural as possible. And this tool is great for you for that if you use it really sparingly. So one way you can do this is to move each of these syllables or notes to their note just by clicking on this dot that says fine pitch and coming up until I get to 0. And I could do that on each one, but there's actually a quicker way. If I just highlight all the blobs and I select set all to perfect pitch, it will move them for me. And I'll just check to make sure that happens. Now, another thing that this can be really good for, it doesn't look like I need to in this case, but it's really good for writing in gain adjustments and equalizing gain so that when you compress the vocal, one compression setting works throughout and the threshold doesn't get tripped up by big sibilants or words that are louder than others. So if I had a soft word, it's this dot on the left-hand side of each rectangle that says gain. I could potentially gain up this particular note, and you can actually see the audio blob get bigger as I add 7 dB of gain, it got bigger, but I want to put that down at 0. These are pretty even, and I'd like to leave them natural in this case. The other thing it would allow you to do, and I would caution you to do this with great care, is you can also smooth these. So when we adjusted the audio, all I did was move the pitch center for each note to the appropriate piano note. I could have come down here to this dot on all of them that says vibrato. I've got all of them selected right now, so whatever I do to this one is going to happen to these. And I could pull this vibrato down to 0. Now that's gonna put these right smoothly in the center of each one, and it's going to start to remove. It's going to make the pitch very good and very accurate and very smooth. but you're also going to start to hear some phase cancellation in the notes, and you lose some of the texture that I think is important. This is what that would sound like. So it's a much smoother sound, but I lost all the texture, and also I can definitely hear the audio's been a little bit degraded. There's definitely some phase cancellation that happens. So I'm going to cancel out that operation. You can see in these squiggly lines that all the texture in my voice returned. Okay, so that's how I would pitch correct one of these tracks. So I'm just going to go through and do it for the rest of these tracks, and then we'll be ready for the next step. Okay, and once you've pitch corrected all of your tracks and all of your vocal comps, you are then ready for the final step, which is to just mix what you've recorded. So our pre-mixed recording sounds like this. I'm not going to get too deep into how I mix this because that's a whole separate course altogether. But I will post a video next week going into more of the specifics of how I mixed this. So go ahead and subscribe, and then next week you can actually see the specific mix moves I made to make this sound like this. So what we have now sounds like this. Sounds really good. So I'm going to share with you the basic idea behind how I mixed it, including a really cool little secret. I'm going to turn the ambiance off. We'll start without reverb, which sounds like this. So basically all I've done is for each track, I've inserted a high-pass filter. I like it below 200 hertz in most cases. I've gone all the way up to 200 hertz for this particular recording because the low end of the song that I'm putting it in is so busy with other things going on that I really need to save space for lots of other instruments. Normally I'd probably high pass at about 150 or so. I've also EQ'd a notch at about 300 or so on each individual vocal track to get rid of some muddiness and boxiness inherent to each voice. And then a little bit of light compression on each one. I've been using a fast attack because there's no sibilant consonants in this part, so I don't have to worry about the consonants jumping up and exploding in the compression. So I'm able to use a little bit faster attack and get a little bit smoother compression. All of that is bussed here via what Logic calls a track stack, which is essentially all of these tracks going through an auxiliary track and I bust them together, and there's a little bit of EQ. I'm using the F6 dynamic EQ from Waves, which I love. And then I use a little bit more compression on the whole thing. I'm using the Klanghelm MJUC compressor, which I also love. It's just a touch of compression on the bus. And then I'm using the VEQ4 from Waves. This is a great plugin. This 15K setting here in this band adds a really nice air to vocals. You have to use it really judiciously because it really jumps out of the mix. And then I'm also using this to cut out a little bit of 3.3K. There's a little bit of harshness throughout. So I smoothed that out by removing a little bit of 3.3K. And then finally, just a little bit of de-essing. Not for any S's, I actually have it a little bit lower. I have it down at 3800, which is a little bit lower than I would typically put a de-esser, because I really want to just capture a little bit of that breath energy that can come up and invade the high end a little bit. So all of that together we heard. And then for ambiance, I am using the wonderful Sound Toys little plate, and I'm feeding that into an EQ. And I'm EQing a lot of the low end out of the plate because I just don't need any more information in the low end than all the other instruments that are in this song. A cappella, it sounds beautiful, to leave more of that low end in that reverb, but in the context of the larger mix, it just creates too much energy down low and starts to muddy things up down there. I've also EQ'd out some of the high end in the little plate to get rid of some of those harsher frequencies that we just don't need. We just don't need those floating around in the space where our cymbals and acoustic guitars and stuff live. So all together, this stuff sounds like this. And then one more little trick I'll show you as part of the step 7, the mix process, is remember that vocal guide we made in MIDI that sounded like this? Well, folks, there's no rules in audio, and I'm adding that as a layer in my harmony arrangement, a subtle layer. And what that's doing is it's adding some more voices that are recorded and EQ'd and engineered separately. So a little bit more interesting dynamic. I'm not putting it very loud. It's more so that you can almost feel it more than you can hear it. But I've also added even some voices, very subtly, some of the high voices that I am not capable of singing, like this. Actually, I probably could sing that with a falsetto, but it sounds so beautiful when they do. And I just really want it subtly. I don't really want that voice to jump out. I just want it to help almost sound like an overtone in the context of the full arrangement. So when I mix in my original MIDI instruments that I kept, those 2 bars sound like this. And really, I could dial in the MIDI to taste. I could even turn that up a bit if I wanted to hear it more, and it would sound like this. And then it starts to almost sound like there's a choir behind the Beach Boys, which is not really the sound that I'm looking for, but actually in the context of my full mix, I don't know that it would matter so much. But there it is. That's my 7-step process for recording big, huge harmony vocal stacks in Logic. Please subscribe. Love to hear comments below. I'd love to know that this was useful for you. Please feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have. Stay safe, have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for watching.